see through it. I have always publicly favored a stronger Medicare program. I wrote a book in 2002 called Saving Lives and Saving Money. I publicly favored Medicare Part D for a practical reason. And that reason is simple. The U.S. government was not prepared to give people anything, insulin, for example, but they would pay for kidney dialysis. They weren't prepared to give people Lipitor, but they'd pay for open heart surgery. That is a terrible way to run Medicare. I am proud of the fact, and I'll say this in Florida, I'm proud of the fact that I publicly, openly advocated Medicare Part D. It has saved lives. It's run on a free enterprise model. It also includes health savings accounts and include Medicare alternatives, which gave people choices. And I did it publicly, and it is not correct, Mitt. I'm just saying this flatly because you've been walking around this state saying things that are untrue. It is not correct to describe public citizenship, having public advocacy as lobbying. Every citizen has the right to do that. And what I did on behalf of Medicare, I did out in the open, publicly, and that is my right as a citizen.
Here's why it's a problem, Mr. Speaker. Here's why it's a problem. And that is if you're getting paid by health companies, if your entities are getting paid by health companies that could benefit from a piece of legislation, and you then meet with Republican congressmen and encourage them to support that legislation, you can call it whatever you'd like. I call it influence peddling. It is not right. It is not right. You have a conflict. You are being paid by companies. At the same time, you're encouraging people to pass legislation which is in their favor.
Governor,
you spent now 15 years in Washington on K Street, and this is a real problem if we're going to nominate someone who not only had a record of great distress as the Speaker, but then has worked for 15 years.
Gentlemen, we've let this go because of the state of the race, and a certain amount of this conversation, I guess, had to happen. This also has to happen. We have to go to a break. We'll come back. We'll talk about foreclosure. We'll talk about foreign policy. We'll welcome in the other two gentlemen of this conversation when we continue from Tampa.
The NBC News Tampa Bay Times National Journal Debate continues in partnership with the Florida Council of 100. Once again, Brian Williams.
Welcome back to what has already become an interesting night in Tampa, Florida. Gentlemen, welcome back to you. And Senator Santorum, let's begin this segment with you. Since we've been nibbling around the edges of the foreclosure crisis, since, 40% of homeowners in this state are underwater, 53% of the homes in Tampa, Florida are worth less today than before this crisis. Was it too easy? Did vehicles of the U.S. government make it too easy to own a home in America?
Well, the answer, unfortunately, is yes to that. And there were several of us in the United States Senate back in 2005 and 2006 who saw this on the horizon, who saw the problem with Freddie and Fannie, and tried to move forth with the bill. I was on the banking committee. We voted a bill out of committee to try to solve this problem, to constrain Fannie and Freddie. And there were a lot of people out there fighting that, including Harry Reid and his minions on the other side of the aisle. I signed a letter along with 24 other senators that said, we either do something now, stop the filibuster of this bill. Harry Reid, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, all of whom were in the Senate at the time. They were filibustering this bill to allow reform of Fannie and Freddie. And we said, if this doesn't happen, if we don't constrain these two behemoths from continuing to underwrite this subprime mortgage problem, then we're going to have a collapse. Unfortunately, that proved to be true. The problem now is, what are you going to do about it? And what I've said is that, as you heard me say before, let capitalism work. Allow these banks to realize their losses and create an opportunity for folks who have houses to realize their losses and at least help them out. That's why I proposed in my tax plan. When I talk about 5 areas where I allowed deductions, well, one of them would be to be able to deduct losses from the sale of your home. Right now, you can't do that. You have to pay gains depending on the amount, but you can't deduct the losses. This is something I think is important temporarily to put in place to allow people the freedom to be able to go out and get out from underneath these houses that they're holding on to, and at least get some relief from the federal government for doing so.
Congressman Paul, should that be any role for the government? Are those folks owed anything for being under?
Well, the government owes them a free market and a sound monetary system, but they didn't give it to them. They gave them a mess. They gave them a financial system that literally created this problem. And it was compounded. First, the line of credit to the Federal Reserve. It was excessive. Everybody now admits in Washington interest rates were kept too low too long. But not only that, in addition to that, it was an insult to injury because they kept interest rates especially low with Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, and there was a line of credit there, and it was a guarantee. Matter of fact, I had introduced legislation 10 years before the bubble burst to eliminate that line of credit. But then the Community Reinvestment Act added more fuel to it, forcing banks to make loans that are risky loans. So the whole bubble was easily seen. The consequences were anticipated. It was all government manufactured. But the question is what do you do after you come upon a mess that the government and the politicians created? The best thing you can do is get out of the way because you want the prices to come down so that people will start buying them again. But politicians can't allow that to happen. Our policies in Washington still has been to try to stimulate houses and keep prices up. But this whole thing about how we get involved in this low interest rate to stimulate the economy, almost everybody in Washington now, and almost all spectrums of the economic sphere, do not believe in wage and price controls. But they believe in controlling interest rates. That's one half of the whole economy. And here we have a bunch of guys getting in a room in secret, deciding what interest rates should be, and they create this mess. So, yes, we need to get out of the way, but instead, the debt has to be liquidated. The mortgage derivatives was a monster. A lot of people made a lot of money on that. But guess what? Federal Reserve, to the tune of trillions and trillions of dollars, as well as TARP funds, were used to bail out the people that made all this money. Guess what happened to the bad debt? They should have been wiped off the book. They should have gone bankrupt. It was dumped on the taxpayers. And the taxpayers still have it. And as long as you maintain that debt on the books, you're not going to have growth. This is why Japan hasn't recovered. We're in 4 years now, and it's going to continue until we understand who creates the business cycle, how it happens, and what you have to do to get out of it.
Gentlemen, 30 seconds, please, on this, starting with Governor Romney. To help these homeowners or not?
To help them, of course we help them. Pam Bondi here in Florida is cracking down on people who are committing fraud, number one. Number two, you have to get government out of the mess. The government's created the mess. Number three, you're going to have to help people see if they can't get more flexibility from their banks. Right now with Dodd-Frank, we made it harder for banks to renegotiate mortgages to help people get out. And finally, you got to get the economy going again with people having jobs. With Florida with 9.9% unemployment and with 18% real unemployment in this state and underemployment, you're not going to get housing recovered unless you get jobs created again.
Speaker.
Well, I think, first of all, if you could repeal Dodd-Frank tomorrow morning, you would see the economy start to improve overnight. I mean, people don't realize, this builds a little bit on what Congressman Paul said. The fact is, Dodd-Frank has led the biggest banks to get bigger. It is crushing independent banks. It has an anti-housing bias. Federal regulators are slowing down and making it harder to make loans for housing, and it is crippling small business borrowing. All those things are a function of a bill passed by the Democrats called Dodd-Frank. If they would repeal it tomorrow morning, you would have a better housing market the next day.
Do you really think the financial system is over-regulated? That's the second mention of Dodd-Frank tonight.
I really think that yes, of course it's overregulated. When you put that much power in the Treasury under Geithner, it's an invitation to corruption. When you have a bias in the bill which makes the big banks get bigger, exactly the opposite of what a rational policy would be, it's a bad bill. When you have regulators walk in small local banks and say, do not loan money on housing, it's a bad idea.
Governor Romney, was it over-regulated prior to the collapse?
It was poorly regulated. Markets have to have regulation to work. You can't have everybody open up a bank in their garage. You have to have regulation, but it's got to be up to date. And they didn't have capital requirements put in place for the different classes of assets banks had. They also didn't have regulation properly put in place for mortgage lenders. The derivatives weren't being regulated. You need to have regulation that's up to date. They had old regulation, burdensome. Then they passed Dodd-Frank, which the Speaker's absolutely right. It has made it almost impossible for community banks. I was with the head of one of the big banks in New York. He said they have hundreds of lawyers working on Dodd-Frank to implement it. Community banks don't have hundreds of lawyers. It's just killing the residential home market, and it's got to be replaced.
Governor Romney, let me ask you this. There was a lot of talk in the last presidential campaign about that 3 a.m. phone call. Let's say President Romney gets that phone call, and it is to say that Fidel Castro has died. And there are credible people in the Pentagon who predict upwards of 500,000 Cubans may take that as a cue to come to the United States. What do you do?
Well, first of all, you thank heavens that Fidel Castro has returned to his maker and will be sent to another land. Number two, you work very aggressively with the new leadership in Cuba to try and move them towards a more open degree than they've had in the past. We just had with Wilman Villar, whose life was just lost in a hunger strike, fighting for democracy. This president has taken a very dangerous course with regards to Cuba, saying we're going to relax relations, we're going to open up travel to Cuba. This is the wrong time for that with this kind of heroics going on. We want to stand with the people of Cuba that want freedom. We want to move that effort forward, not by giving in and saying we lost, but by saying we will fight for democracy.
Mr. Speaker, as a practical matter, along the Florida coast, though, you know the policy, so-called wet foot, dry foot. What do you do if folks start arriving in the United States?
Well, Brian, first of all, I guess the only thing I would suggest is I don't think that Fidel's going to meet his maker. I think he's going to go the other place. Second, I would suggest to you, the policy of the United States should be aggressively to overthrow the regime and to do everything we can to support those Cubans who want freedom. You know, Obama is very infatuated with an Arab Spring. He doesn't seem to be able to look 90 miles south of the United States to have a Cuban Spring. So I would try to put in place a very aggressive policy of reaching out to every single Cuban who would like to be free, helping network them together, reaching out to the younger generation inside the dictatorship and indicating they don't have a future as a dictatorship because a Gingrich presidency will not tolerate 4 more years of this dictatorship.
Overt and covert? Are you talking about engaging the U.S. military?
No, I'm talking about using every asset available in the United States, including appropriate covert operations, to maximize the distance. What Ronald Reagan, Pope John Paul II, and Margaret Thatcher did to the Soviet Empire. Bring together every asset we have to minimize the survival of the dictatorship and to maximize the chance for freedom in Cuba.
Congressman?
I have a little bit of work to do yet on him on foreign policy. No. I would do pretty much the opposite. I don't like the isolationism of not talking to people. I was drafted in 1962 at the height of the Cold War when the missiles were in Cuba. And the Cold War is over. And I think we propped up Castro for 40-some years because we put on these sanctions, and this only used us as the scapegoat. He could always say, anything wrong, it's the United States' fault. But I think it's time to quit this isolation business of not talking to people. We talked to the Soviets, we talked to the Chinese, and we opened up trade, and we're not killing each other now. We fought with the Vietnamese for a long time. We finally gave up, started talking to them. Now we trade with them. I don't know why the Cuban people should be so intimidated. Brett, I don't know where you get this assumption that all of a sudden all the Cubans that come over here, I would thought they were going to celebrate and they're going to have a lot more freedom if we would only open up our doors and say, we want to talk to you and trade with you and come visit. Sometimes they can't even send packages down there. I think we're living in the dark ages when we can't even talk to the Cuban people. I think it's not 1962 anymore, and we don't have to use force and intimidation and overthrow in governments. I just don't think that's going to work.
Senator Santorum, an admittedly cynical question. If there was a strong lobby of Chinese dissidents living in a state as politically important as Florida, do you think we'd have a trade policy with China that looks more like the trade policy with Cuba?
Not if they were not 90 miles off our shore. This is an important doctrine of the United States to make sure that our hemisphere and those who are close to us are folks that we can and should deal with. And right now we have and have had for 50 years a dictatorship in Cuba. We've had sanctions on them. They should continue. They should continue until the Castros are dead, and then we should make it very clear that if you want mountains of aid, if you want normal relationships, if you want to improve your economy, if you want to have the opportunity for freedom, that the United States stands ready now to embrace you now that you've gotten rid of these tyrants who have controlled you for these 50-plus years. That's why the sanctions have to stay in place, because we need to have a very solid offer to come forward and help the Cuban people. And you're right, Ron, it's not 1962. They're now, with the Cubans and the Venezuelans, the Nicaraguans, there is a growing network of folks now working with the jihadists, the Iranians, who are very, very excited about the opportunity to having platforms 90 miles off our coast, just like the Soviets were. Very anxious to have platforms 90 miles off our coast, or in Venezuela, or in Nicaragua, and other places that could come across the southern border. This is a serious threat. It's a threat that I've been talking about for about 6 or 7 years, and it's one that's not going to go away until we confront the threat and hopefully are able to convince the Cuban people that, through what Newt and others have suggested, to change their government at the appropriate time.